The air in the attic of Sterling Manor tasted of ancient dust and forgotten dreams. It was a suffocating gray space where the only light came from a single barred window that overlooked the sprawling gardens Clara Blackwood was forbidden to touch. Her fingers, stained with the ink of a stolen quill, trembled as she pressed the nib to a scrap of yellowing parchment. Locked away in the attic by her cruel stepmother, she believed love was over, until a duke discovered the letter she had secretly written. This is a story of a soul buried alive in the rafters of high society, a girl who became a ghost before she ever became a woman. Clara was the secret shame of the Blackwood estate, kept in the shadows by Eleanor Sterling, a woman whose heart was as cold as the diamonds she wore. For 10 years, Clara's world had been the four walls of this timber cage, her only companions the spiders and the echoes of a life she used to have. But tonight the silence was too heavy. The loneliness was a physical weight on her chest, a slow-acting poison. Clara wasn't just writing a letter, she was screaming on paper. "To whoever finds this," she whispered as she wrote, her voice a fragile rasp. "I am not a ghost. I am a woman who remembers the scent of jasmine and the sound of laughter. I am a prisoner of a hate I did not earn. If you find this, know that I existed. Know that I was here and I was brave. Hello to my incredible community of storytellers. I am so glad you've joined us for this journey into the heart of Victorian secrets and soaring romance. Before we unlock the doors to this attic, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Are you tucked away in a cozy room or perhaps out in the world Clara longs to see? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into emotional resilience and justice, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It's the only way to ensure you never miss a chapter of these epic tales. How are you all doing today? I hope your day is filled with the kind of light Clara is searching for. In an act of sheer, desperate rebellion, Clara rolled the parchment tight. She didn't have a seal, so she used a piece of frayed ribbon from her hair, the only thing she had left of her mother. She stood at the barred window, the wind howling like a wounded animal. She shouldn't do it. If Eleanor found out, the meager scraps of bread would stop. The candle would be taken. But the fire in Clara's soul was brighter than her fear. She pushed the small scroll through the narrow gap in the rusted bars. For a heartbeat, it hovered, caught on a splinter of wood. Then the wind snatched it. Clara watched, her breath hitching as the white speck danced over the manicured hedges, over the stone walls of the estate, and vanished into the darkness of the woods beyond. "Goodbye," she breathed, a single tear carving a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't know that miles away, a carriage bearing the crest of the most feared man in the country was rattling down the forest road. She didn't know that a stray gust of wind was about to drop her soul into the lap of Arthur Pendragon, the Duke of Wells. A man who had spent his life building walls of his own, walls of stone, of title and of ice. A man who believed love was a myth sold to the weak. The letter was about to change everything. But as Clara turned back to her straw pallet in the dark, she only felt one thing, the terrifying, hollow realization that she had just sent her heart into the void. Would it be stepped on? Would it be burned? Or would it be the key that finally turned the lock? The letter did not fall into the mud. It did not snag on a bramble or drown in a puddle. Instead, through a trick of fate or perhaps a mercy from the heavens, it flew through the open window of a moving brougham. It landed directly upon the lap of a man draped in charcoal wool and heavy silence. Arthur Pendragon, the Duke of Wells, looked down at the scrap of parchment with a frown that could wither a rose. Arthur was a man of cold, hard geometry. His life was measured in land deeds, political maneuvers, and the relentless pursuit of order. He was the Stone Duke, a title earned because his heart was rumored to be carved from the very granite that built his ancestral seat. To Arthur, emotions were messy variables that complicated the elegant math of power. "Your Grace," his valet Thomas Miller asked from the seat across from him, "is something the matter?" Arthur didn't answer. He picked up the scroll. It smelled of wood smoke and a faint, lingering trace of dried lavender. He unrolled it, expecting a common plea for alms or a threat from a rival. Instead, his eyes met the frantic, elegant script of a woman who sounded as though she were drowning in shadows. "I am the girl the sun forgot. I watch the seasons change through iron bars, and I wonder if the world has forgotten that I still draw breath. They tell me I am a burden, a stain on a proud name, but in my dreams I am a queen of the wildwood. Whoever you are, breathe the fresh air once for me. Just once. Arthur's grip on the parchment tightened. For the first time in a decade, a crack appeared in the ice surrounding his heart. These weren't the words of a beggar. They were the words of a poet in a cage. He looked out the window at the passing silhouette of the Sterling estate, a place he had intended to visit to discuss a mundane land boundary. Now the house looked different. It looked like a fortress. Meanwhile, back in the rafters of Sterling Manor, the door to the attic groaned open. The sound was like a physical blow to Clara's stomach. Eleanor Sterling stepped inside, holding a silk handkerchief to her nose as if the very air Clara breathed was a contagion. Eleanor was a woman of sharp, polished beauty, a porcelain doll with a heart of jagged glass. She had married Clara's father for his title and buried him within a year, leaving her the mistress of his house and the jailer of his only child. Still scribbling, I see, Eleanor said, her voice a low, melodic venom. She kicked a stack of Clara's old papers, scattering them across the dusty floor. You look more like your mother every day, Clara. That same pathetic, wide-eyed look of hope. It's disgusting. My mother was a lady, Clara whispered, her chin lifting despite the trembling in her knees. And this is still her house. Eleanor's hand lashed out, a stinging slap that sent Clara staggering back against the timber beams. This house is mine. Your father left you to me, Clara, to ensure you never embarrassed the Sterling name with your eccentricities. You are a burden. You are a shadow. And shadows do not speak. Eleanor walked to the window, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the lack of a ribbon in Clara's hair. Where is it? The scrap of silk you were so fond of. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. I lost it. It fell through the floorboards. Eleanor leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and cruelty. If I find out you've been trying to signal the servants again, I'll board this window up entirely. You think you're lonely now? Try living in a room where the sun never rises. When the door slammed shut and the heavy iron bolt slid home, Clara collapsed onto her knees. Her deepest fear wasn't the darkness. It was the realization that she was starting to believe Eleanor. She was starting to believe she was nothing. She looked at her ink-stained fingers and wondered if the letter she had sent was just a final, foolish gasp of a dying spirit. She didn't know that the Stone Duke was currently sitting in his study, the letter spread out beneath a flickering candle, his strategic mind already beginning to map out a war. He didn't know the girl, but he knew the handwriting of a soul that refused to break. And Arthur Pendragon had always been a man who collected rare and precious things. We are building the foundation of a clash that will shake the very foundations of the ton. If you're already hating Eleanor and rooting for Clara, hit that like button right now. And tell me, have you ever felt like you were unseen? This story is for everyone who has ever felt like they were living in the shadows. Subscribe to see how the Duke brings the light. Arthur looked at Thomas. Miller, find out everything you can about the Blackwood girl. The one the Sterlings claim went away to a convent in the north 10 years ago. The convent, Your Grace? Miller asked, surprised. The rumor was she was sickly and preferred the cloister. Arthur looked at the letter, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, dark fire. This was not written in a cloister. This was written in a grave. And I intend to find the person who dug it. The connection was forged. The Duke's cold logic was being replaced by a burning, inexplicable curiosity. And Clara's quiet strength was about to meet the most powerful shield in the kingdom. The following morning, Sterling Manor was a hive of frantic activity. Eleanor Sterling was not a woman who welcomed surprises, but when the ducal carriage, bearing the obsidian and gold crest of the Pendragons, rolled up the gravel drive, she nearly dropped her tea. The Duke of Wells did not visit. He summoned. He commanded. He appeared only where he had an interest to protect or a rival to crush. Arthur Pendragon stepped into the grand foyer, his black boots clicking with a lethal rhythm. He didn't wait to be announced. He strode into the drawing room where Eleanor sat, her face a mask of practiced, aristocratic grace. Your Grace, Eleanor said, dropping into a deep curtsy. To what do we owe this unexpected honor? We were under the impression our land dispute was settled by mail. Settled? No, Arthur said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the very crystals of the chandelier. I find that paper is a poor substitute for a personal inspection of the boundaries. He paced the room, his eyes scanning every corner with the precision of a hawk. He wasn't looking at the art or the furniture. He was looking for a sign. A shadow. I have heard rumors, Lady Sterling, Arthur said, stopping abruptly before her, that your late husband had a daughter. A girl named Clara. I find it curious that in all my years attending the king's court, I have never seen her. Eleanor's smile didn't waver, but her fingers twitched. Ah, poor Clara. A tragic case, your grace. She was always a fragile thing, spiritually and physically. She has been at a secluded convent in the Highlands for years. She has found her peace in silence. Is that so? Arthur reached into his pocket and produced the scrap of parchment. He didn't show her the text, he only showed her the ribbon. Then perhaps you can explain why a bird dropped this at my feet last night. A ribbon with the Blackwood crest, tied to a letter that describes a life quite different from a Highland convent. Eleanor's eyes flared with a sudden, sharp panic. A prank, surely. The servants. I don't believe in pranks, Arthur interrupted. And I don't believe in coincidences. I wish to see the attic, Lady Sterling. The attic. Eleanor laughed, a high, brittle sound. It is a dusty storage space, your grace. It is beneath your dignity. My dignity is my own to manage, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Lead the way or I shall find it myself. And I assure you I am very good at breaking things that stand in my way. Upstairs, Clara heard the commotion. It was rare for voices to carry this high, but the house felt different today, vibrant, charged with an energy she didn't recognize. She pressed her ear to the floorboards, her heart racing. Suddenly she heard the heavy rhythmic thud of boots on the stairs leading to the servants' quarters. No one ever came this way except for Eleanor or the terrified maid who brought her gruel. The iron bolt screeched. The door swung open. Clara scrambled back, shielding her eyes from the sudden, blinding influx of hallway light. For a moment she saw only a silhouette, a massive, imposing figure that blocked out the entire world. Clara Blackwood? The voice was like velvet over steel. It wasn't Eleanor. It wasn't a servant. Clara lowered her hands, her eyes adjusting to the light. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had been forged from the very night itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in the finest black velvet, but it was his eyes that stopped her breath, intense, piercing, and currently filled with a mixture of shock and a growing dark fury. Who are you? She whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. Arthur Pendragon didn't answer immediately. He took in the sight of her, the tattered dress, the ink-stained fingers, the hollow cheeks, and yet the defiance in her posture. She was the woman from the letter. She was the girl the sun forgot. I am the man who found your letter, Arthur said, stepping into the room. He ignored the layer of dust on the floor, his focus entirely on her. And I am the man who is taking you out of here. Your Grace, you cannot. Eleanor shrieked from the doorway, her face twisted in rage. She is a minor. She is under my legal guardianship. This is kidnapping. Arthur turned his head, his gaze so cold Eleanor actually recoiled. It is not kidnapping to remove a lady from a kennel, Lady Sterling. It is a restoration of order. You told the world she was in a convent. I find her in a cage. The King's Bench will be very interested in the discrepancy. Arthur turned back to Clara. He reached out a hand, palm up. It was the first time in 10 years anyone had offered her anything other than a blow or a bowl of thin soup. The carriage is waiting, Clara, he said, his voice softening just a fraction. The world hasn't forgotten you. I haven't forgotten you. The inciting incident had been sparked. Clara looked at the hand, then at the open door, and then at the monster who had kept her in the dark. For the first time she saw Eleanor not as a giant, but as a small, shivering coward. Clara reached out and placed her hand in Arthur's. His grip was warm, solid, and absolute. Take me away, she whispered. As they walked out, Arthur didn't just lead her, he shielded her. He placed his cloak around her shoulders, hiding her rags from the prying eyes of the servants. But as they reached the front door, Eleanor screamed one final, desperate threat. You'll regret this, Duke. You've taken a girl with no name and no dowry. She is nothing. Arthur paused at the threshold, his arm around Clara's waist. She has the name of Blackwood and the protection of Pendragon. That makes her more powerful than you could ever dream of being. But as the carriage pulled away, Clara saw a shadow in the window of the library. It wasn't Eleanor. It was a man she didn't recognize. A man with a ledger in his hand. The first major twist was about to unfold. Eleanor wasn't acting alone. We are moving into the heart of the mystery. If you love seeing a powerful man stand up for what's right, give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe. We're about to see just how deep this conspiracy goes. Wyvern Hall was a sprawling masterpiece of gray stone and emerald ivy, but to Clara, it felt like another planet. For the first few days she moved through the high-ceilinged galleries like a ghost. The softness of the rugs felt strange beneath her feet. The abundance of food on the silver trays made her stomach ache with a memory of hunger. Arthur remained a shadow in his own home. He was a man of few words, but his presence was felt in every luxury bestowed upon her. He had summoned the finest modistes to drape her in silks of sage and cream, and he had tasked Miller with ensuring she was never left in a room without a fire. Yet as the physical bruises faded, the emotional tension only grew. Clara found herself watching him from the library balcony. He worked late into the night, his brow furrowed over stacks of legal documents. He was a man of logic, yet he had acted on a whim of the heart. One evening, Clara found him in the conservatory, staring at a rare night blooming cereus. "You haven't asked me anything," Clara said, her voice sounding stronger than it had a week ago. "You saved me, but you haven't asked why I was there. Or what I want." Arthur turned, his eyes tracking the way the moonlight caught the new luster in her hair. "I know why you were there, Clara. Greed is a simple motive. As for what you want, I assumed it was safety. I want to know why you did it," she challenged, stepping closer. "A duke does not risk a scandal for a girl in an attic. Not unless there is a reason." Arthur reached out, his fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve but never quite touching her skin. "I told myself it was for justice. But the truth? Your letter. It spoke of a strength that I have spent my life trying to build. I wanted to see if the woman was as real as the words." The air between them sparked with a growing attraction, a magnetic pull that terrified Clara as much as it thrilled her. But as their connection deepened, the world outside was conspiring to pull them apart. Is this the kind of mystery that keeps you up at night? If you're waiting to see if Clara and Arthur can truly find happiness, leave a comment with the word justice. And if you haven't yet, join our community by subscribing. It's the only way to ensure you're here for the grand finale. While Clara was finding her footing at Wyvern Hall, the atmosphere at Stirling Manor had turned from desperate to deadly. Eleanor Stirling was no longer alone in the drawing room. Sitting across from her was Silas Vane, a man with a serpent's smile and a ledger that held the secrets of half the aristocracy. "You let the Duke take her, Eleanor," Silas said, his voice a cold hiss. "Do you have any idea what happens if he looks into the Blackwood accounts? If he discovers that your husband's debts were fabricated? If he finds out the girl is actually the wealthiest heiress in the county?" "I couldn't stop him, Silas. He had the Pendragon Guard with him," Eleanor snapped, her hands shaking as she poured a glass of brandy. "We need her back. Or we need her silenced," Silas replied, leaning forward into the firelight. "The Duke believes he has rescued a pauper. If we plant evidence that she is mentally unstable, that her imprisonment was for her own safety, we can discredit her. And if that fails, accidents happen to fragile girls." Back at Wyvern Hall, Arthur began to notice red herrings being planted by his rivals. Letters arrived from concerned neighbors claiming Clara had a history of violent outbursts. Her father's old physician, a man on Silas Vane's payroll, sent a medical file detailing her supposed madness. Arthur's strategic mind was being tested. He saw the traps being set, but every time he looked at Clara, every time she laughed at a passage in a book or looked at the sunset with tears of joy, his resolve hardened. However, the tension reached a breaking point when Clara found a hidden compartment in her mother's old jewelry box, which Arthur had recovered from the manor. Inside was a single charred page of her father's true will. It wasn't just about a name, it was about a fortune that Eleanor had been bleeding dry for years. "Arthur," Clara said, bursting into his study, her face pale. "My father didn't leave me to her. He left me to a trustee, a man named Silas Vane." Arthur stood, his face darkening like a summer storm. "Vane? He's the most corrupt solicitor in London. If he's her partner, then this wasn't just cruelty, Clara. This was a decade-long heist. The obstacles were mounting. It wasn't just a stepmother anymore. It was a conspiracy of the powerful." And as Arthur realized the depth of the danger Clara was in, he also realized something else. something he had sworn he would never feel. He was in love with her. And in his world, love was the most dangerous weakness of all. The library at Wyvern Hall was silent, save for the rhythmic crackle of the hearth and the frantic scratching of Arthur's pen. But the air felt heavy like the atmosphere before a catastrophic storm. Clara stood by the window, the charred scrap of her father's will clutched in her hand. The truth was unraveling, and it was uglier than anything she had imagined in the dark of her attic. "If Silas Vane was my trustee," Clara whispered, her voice trembling, "then he was paid to protect me. He was paid to ensure I was educated, cared for, and introduced to society." Instead, he watched as Eleanor locked the door. Arthur looked up from the ledgers he had spent the last 48 hours dissecting. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw set in a line of grim iron. "It's worse than that, Clara. Look at these dates." He beckoned her over, spreading a map of bank transfers across the mahogany desk. Every quarter for 10 years, Vane authorized a massive withdrawal from the Blackwood Trust for Clara's medical care and convent tuition. But the money didn't go to a doctor or a church. It went into a shell company owned by Silas Vane himself. And in return for his silence, he allowed Eleanor to live in the manor and spend the remainder on her own debts. Clara felt a wave of nausea. I was a gold mine to them. A gold mine they had to keep hidden so the dividends wouldn't stop. "But here is the game changer," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He stood up, walking around the desk until he was inches from her. He reached out, taking the charred paper from her hands. "This isn't just a copy of a will. It's a codicil. Your father knew Vane was a snake." He added a clause. "If you were to marry a man of equal or greater rank than a duke before your 25th birthday, the entire estate, including Stirling Manor, transfers to your husband's control immediately." Vane and Eleanor would be left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a prison sentence for fraud. The stakes hadn't just been raised, they had exploded. Clara realized why Eleanor had been so desperate to keep her hidden. If she never met anyone, she could never marry. If she never married, the parasites could feed on her father's legacy forever. "Arthur," Clara breathed, her heart racing. "They won't just try to discredit me now. They have to kill me before I turn 25. Or they have to kill you." Arthur didn't flinch. Instead, he did something that challenged everything he believed about himself. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. His touch was no longer cold. It was a desperate, burning anchor. "Let them try," he growled. "I spent my life believing that a heart was a liability in a world of wolves. But looking at you, knowing what you endured while still being able to write those words of hope, I realize I wasn't living. I was just guarding a tomb." He leaned down, and for a heartbeat the world stopped. The kiss was a revelation. A shared vulnerability that stripped away his titles and her trauma. It was a promise of war and a promise of sanctuary. But the moment was shattered by a frantic pounding on the library door. Miller burst in, his face ghostly. "Your Grace, a carriage has just entered the gates. It bears the seal of the Home Office. And Silas Vane is in the lead, carrying an arrest warrant." Arthur stepped in front of Clara, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the ceremonial sword on the wall. "On what grounds?" "Murder," Miller gasped. "They are claiming you didn't rescue Clara. They are claiming you killed the real Clara Blackwood years ago and replaced her with a common charlatan to seize the Blackwood fortune. They've produced a body, Your Grace. They've dug up a grave in the Stirling Woods and claimed it's hers." The betrayal was total. Eleanor and Vane hadn't just come to take her back. They had come to erase her existence entirely. By claiming Clara was an imposter, they could have Arthur executed for treason and murder, and Clara would disappear into a madhouse where no one would ever hear her voice again. Everything Clara and Arthur believed about their safety was a lie. The hunters had become the law, and the Duke was now the most wanted man in England. The trap has snapped shut. The Stone Duke is facing the gallows, and Clara's identity is being stolen by the very people who imprisoned her. If you're screaming at the screen right now, let me know in the comments. Hit that like button if you want to see Arthur and Clara fight back. The iron gates of Wyvern Hall didn't just open, they were breached. The silence of the night was shattered by the heavy tread of the King's Guard and the shrill, triumphant voice of Silas Vane. Within minutes, the sanctuary that Clara had come to love was transformed into a cold, clinical crime scene. "Arthur Pendragon, Duke of Wells," Silas Vane proclaimed, standing in the center of the grand foyer with a smirk that curdled the air. By the authority of the Home Office, you are under arrest for the murder of the Lady Clara Blackwood and the subsequent conspiracy to install a pretender in her place. Arthur didn't move. He stood on the grand staircase, his arm protectively around Clara. But as the guards leveled their muskets, he felt the cold reality of the trap. Vane had been meticulous. By producing a nameless corpse and bribing the local magistrate, he had turned the law into a blunt instrument of execution. "Don't touch her," Arthur growled, his voice a low, predatory vibration. "Touch her." Eleanor Sterling stepped out from behind the guards, her eyes glinting with a manic dark joy. "We are simply taking the impostor into custody for questioning. After all, she is the primary witness to your crimes, Your Grace." They tore Clara from Arthur's side. The separation was a physical agony, a jagged tear in the fabric of their newly discovered world. "Arthur!" Clara screamed, her fingers slipping from his. "Find the locket, Clara." Arthur roared as 3 guards forced him to his knees, binding his wrists in heavy iron. "The locket and the floorboards. It's the only way." Before he could say more, a guard struck him with the butt of a rifle. Arthur collapsed and Clara's world went black as a burlap sack was thrown over her head. The carriage ride was a descent into hell. When the hood was finally removed, Clara wasn't in a prison or a courtroom. She was back in the one place she had prayed she would never see again. The attic. The dust was thicker now, the shadows longer. Eleanor stood in the doorway, the light from her candle casting a monstrous silhouette against the rafters. "You thought you were a duchess, didn't you?" Eleanor hissed, locking the iron bolt with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. "You thought that cold-hearted man would save you. By this time tomorrow he will be in the Tower of London and you will simply cease to exist. Silas has already arranged for a private asylum in the moors. You'll never see the sun again, Clara. Not even through these bars." As the footsteps faded down the stairs, Clara collapsed onto the cold, splintered wood. This was her darkest hour. Arthur was facing the gallows because he tried to love her. The fortune that should have been her freedom was the very rope being used to hang them both. The situation was hopeless. She had no food, no light, and her only ally was in chains. She looked at the single barred window. The wind howled through the gaps, mocking her. "Love is a weakness," Arthur had once said. Had he been right? Had their love only provided Eleanor with the target she needed to destroy them both? Is this the end for our lovers? Feels like the shadows have finally won. If your heart is breaking for Clara right now, type hope in the comments. We need all the positive energy we can get. And please, if you want to see if they can escape this nightmare, make sure you're subscribed. Clara lay in the dark, her tears wetting the dust. But then she remembered Arthur's final words. The locket. The floorboards. He hadn't been talking about the jewelry box she had already found. He had been talking about the attic. Arthur's strategic mind had seen the possibility of her recapture before he was even taken. He had known she would be brought back here. With shaking hands, Clara began to crawl across the floor, her fingers frantically searching the gaps in the timber. Her nails bled as she clawed at the wood. Please, she prayed. Please let him have found it. Near the corner where she used to huddle for warmth, she felt it. A loose board. She pried it up, her breath catching. Tucked away in a small velvet-lined hole was a silver locket. But it wasn't a piece of jewelry. When she snapped it open, she found a miniature portrait of her mother. And behind the portrait, a tiny, folded piece of vellum. It was a birth certificate. But not hers. It was the birth certificate of a twin brother Clara never knew she had. A brother who had died in infancy, whose death had been hidden by Eleanor to ensure the Blackwood fortune didn't revert to a different branch of the family tree. But more importantly, inside the locket was a small leaden seal belonging to the king's own private physician. Arthur hadn't just been researching land deeds. He had uncovered a medical secret that proved Eleanor had been falsifying deaths and births for decades. The hope was a small, flickering flame, but it was enough. Clara stood up, her eyes narrowing in the dark. She was no longer the girl who wrote letters to the wind. She was a woman who had the power to burn the Sterling name to the ground. But how could she get the evidence to the tower? The door was locked and the guards were below. The darkest hour was not over. The fire was only just beginning to catch. The silver locket felt like a live coal in Clara's palm. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a physical manifestation of Arthur's faith in her. He had known that if the world fell apart he had to give her the weapon to rebuild it. But a weapon was useless if the soldier was still behind bars. Clara looked at the barred window. For 10 years, those bars had been the boundaries of her existence. She had looked through them with longing but never with the intent to break them. Now the quiet girl was gone. The woman who had been loved by a duke took her place. She didn't have a file or a hammer. But she had the heavy, iron-bound chair her stepmother had left in the corner, a mocking reminder of her station. Using every ounce of strength fueled by 10 years of suppressed rage, Clara swung the chair against the rusted iron bars. Clang! The sound echoed through the rafters like a war drum. Clang! The wood of the chair splintered but the rust on the bars gave way. On the third strike the center bar groaned and snapped, tumbling into the night. She squeezed through the narrow gap, the cold night air biting at her skin. Below her, the ivy that clung to the stone walls was thick and ancient. One slip meant death on the cobblestones. But as she looked down she didn't see the height. She saw the road to the Tower of London. We are witnessing the birth of a legend. Clara is literally breaking her own chains. If you're cheering for her escape, I want to see courage in the comments right now. This is the turning point we've all been waiting for. Don't forget to subscribe as we head into the final confrontation. Clara climbed down the ivy, her hands shredded and bleeding, but she didn't feel the pain. She reached the ground and vanished into the woods, heading for the village stables. She had never ridden a horse, but she had watched the grooms from her window for a decade. She stole a mare, whispered a prayer to the mother she barely remembered, and rode as if the devil himself were at her heels. Meanwhile, at the Tower of London the atmosphere was funereal. Arthur Pendragon sat in a damp stone cell, his eyes fixed on the small patch of sky visible through the high window. The door creaked open. Silas Vane stepped in, accompanied by the High Magistrate. "The trial begins in 1 hour, Your Grace," Vane said, his voice smooth as oil. "The king has been told of your crimes. The verdict is a foregone conclusion. If you sign over your interest in the Blackwood boundary lands now, I might be able to convince the executioner to give you a quick end. Otherwise, the block is very dull this morning." Arthur looked at Vane, a slow, chilling smile spreading across his face. "You've made one mistake, Vane." "Oh, and what is that?" "You assumed I was the one you should be afraid of," Arthur said, his voice steady. "But I am just the man who opened the cage. You have no idea what's coming for you." Just as Vane opened his mouth to retort, a commotion erupted in the hallway. The sound of shouting guards and the heavy thud of the tower's main portcullis being raised echoed through the stone. The cell door was thrown open. But it wasn't the executioner. It was Clara. She was covered in mud, her dress was torn to ribbons, and her hands were stained with blood and ink. She looked like a wild thing, but her eyes held a fire that made the High Magistrate step back in shock. "Stop this madness," she commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of a queen. She held up the silver locket and the vellum birth certificate. "I am the Lady Clara Blackwood, daughter of the Earl of Stirling. And I have the proof that Silas Vane and Eleanor Stirling have committed high treason against the crown by falsifying the lineage of this house for 10 years. The High Magistrate snatched the documents. As he read the king's physician's seal, his face went from pale to ghostly white. The turning point had arrived. The evidence didn't just clear Arthur. It turned the weight of the law squarely onto the necks of the conspirators. "Seize him," the magistrate barked, pointing at Vane. Vane tried to bolt, but Arthur, moving with the speed of a coiled spring, tripped the solicitor and pinned him to the floor with a heavy boot on his throat. Arthur looked up at Clara. The Stone Duke let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a lifetime. He reached out his hand and she took it, pulling him up from the shadows of the cell. "You found it," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with pride. "I didn't just find it, Arthur," Clara said, leaning her forehead against his. "I found myself." The tide had turned and the hunt for justice was about to reach its climactic end. The storm that had been brewing in Clara's soul for 10 years finally broke over Stirling Manor. It was not a storm of rain but of retribution. Arthur's ducal guard, now reinforced by the king's own men, surrounded the estate like a ring of iron. The front doors, which had once felt like the gates of a tomb to Clara, were thrown open with a crash that rattled the very foundations of the house. Eleanor Stirling stood at the top of the grand staircase, a glass of dark wine in her hand, her face a mask of crumbling porcelain. She had been waiting for news of Arthur's execution. Instead, she saw the ghost she had tried to bury walking through her front door, flanked by the man who had become her living nightmare. "You!" Eleanor shrieked, the glass shattering at her feet. "You should be in the moors. You should be dead." "I have been dead for 10 years, Eleanor," Clara said, her voice calm, cold, and carrying to every corner of the foyer. "But today I've decided to live. And that means you must finally face the light." Arthur stepped forward, the iron of his shackles replaced by the glint of a drawn sword. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at the woman who had dared to touch what was his. "The High Magistrate has the birth certificate, Eleanor. He has the records of the trust. And Silas Vane is currently in a cell, singing like a bird to save his own neck. He's already told them everything: the drugs, the forged debts, and the child you replaced." The final, most satisfying twist was about to be delivered. "But there's one thing Silas didn't know," Arthur continued, producing a final, sealed document from his breast pocket. "When I was in the tower, I didn't just wait for Clara. I sent a courier to the Highlands. It turns out your convent story was more than a lie. You actually sent a girl there 10 years ago to pose as Clara, a poor orphan you picked from the streets to ensure no one would come looking for the real heiress." Eleanor's eyes widened. That girl died of fever." "No," Clara said, stepping beside Arthur. "She didn't. She's alive. And she arrived in London an hour ago to testify. You didn't just steal my life, Eleanor. You tried to erase 2 lives for the price of 1. The climax reached its fever pitch as the king's guards moved up the stairs. Eleanor retreated, her back hitting the door of the library. She looked around at the portraits of the Blackwood ancestors, men and women who had stood for honor, and realized she was a stranger in a house that had already rejected her. "I gave you everything," Eleanor screamed, a final, pathetic plea. "I kept this estate running when your father's heart failed. I did it for the sterling name." "You did it for yourself," Clara replied. "And in doing so you lost the only thing that mattered." As the guards led Eleanor away in chains, she passed Clara. For the first time, Eleanor had to look up at the girl she had kept in the dirt. Clara didn't strike her. She didn't spit. She simply reached out and took the keys to the manor from Eleanor's belt. "The attic is being converted into a conservatory, Eleanor," Clara whispered. "I'm letting the sun in. Something you'll never see again. The victory is ours. The villains are in chains, and the Stone Duke has shown the world that his heart is made of fire, not ice." If you felt that shiver of justice, hit that like button and comment, "Triumph." We are heading into the final chapter of this epic romance. Arthur turned to Clara in the sudden silence of the foyer. The house felt lighter, the shadows retreating as the servants, many of whom had been forced into silence by Eleanor's threats, began to weep with relief. "It's over, Clara," Arthur said, sheathing his blade. He looked at her, his expression one of raw, authentic adoration. "The manor is yours. The fortune is yours. You are the most powerful woman in this county." Clara looked at the keys in her hand, then she looked at him. She realized that while the gold was a tool, the man standing before her was her home. "I don't want the manor, Arthur," she said, tossing the keys onto the marble table. "I spent 10 years in these walls. I want to see the world you promised me. I want to see the wildwood. I want to see the place where you go when the sun sets." Arthur didn't say a word. He simply pulled her into a kiss that tasted of freedom and the future. The Duke of Wells had finally met a force more strategic and more powerful than any political move: the heart of a woman who refused to stay hidden. The bells of St. Jude's Cathedral didn't just ring. They seemed to sing, a jubilant, brassy roar that swept through the streets of London and echoed all the way to the green hills of the countryside. It was the wedding the Tun had whispered about for months, the union of the Stone Duke and the Sunlight Duchess. Clara stood in the vestibule, her reflection in the gilded mirror a far cry from the soot-stained girl in the rafters. Her gown was a masterpiece of ivory lace and seed pearls, but the true jewel was the glow in her eyes. She no longer looked like a ghost. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and emerged as gold. Beside her, Miller, no longer just a valet but a trusted friend, beamed with pride. "The carriage is ready, Your Grace. But I suspect the Duke is rather impatient. He's checked his pocket watch 3 times in the last minute." Clara laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "Let him wait 1 more minute, Miller. I want to savor the feeling of walking toward a door that is meant to be opened. As the heavy oak doors swung wide, the cathedral fell into a hushed, reverent silence. Arthur stood at the altar, looking every bit the powerful nobleman, but as Clara began her walk down the aisle, the mask of the Duke finally, completely shattered. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down his cheek, a sign of a man whose heart had been permanently thawed. The ceremony was not just a joining of two names, but a public declaration of a new era. The Blackwood Pendragon legacy would not be built on secrets or cages, but on the courage to be seen. We've reached the end of our journey. From a dusty attic to a ducal throne, Clara's story is a reminder that no matter how dark the room, the light always finds a way. If you loved this ending as much as I did, please leave a comment with the word forever. It's been an absolute honor telling this story for you. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next adventure. Months later at Wyvern Hall, the attic was unrecognizable. The bars had been removed, replaced by sprawling floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the wildwood Clara had once only dreamed of. The room was now a sanctuary of art and botany, filled with the scent of jasmine and the sound of children's laughter. Clara sat at a writing desk, the same one where she had once poured out her loneliness. But now the letters she wrote were to the girls in the local orphanages she had founded, letters filled with encouragement, books, and the promise that they were never ever invisible. Arthur walked in, leaning down to press a kiss to the crown of her head. He placed a fresh cup of tea on her desk, his touch lingering. The architect says the new schoolhouse in the village will be finished by spring, Arthur said, his voice a warm, steady anchor. He's calling it the Blackwood Academy. Clara leaned back into his embrace, closing her eyes. My father would have liked that. He would have liked that his name is finally associated with a beginning rather than an end. The loose ends were all tied. Eleanor Sterling remained in her exile, a woman forgotten by the society she had tried so desperately to rule. Silas Vane's name had been struck from every legal record in the country. But for Arthur and Clara, the past was merely the prologue. The story that began with a desperate letter in a bottle had ended in a sea of tranquility. They had found in each other the one thing the world tried to tell them didn't exist, a love that was both a shield and a bridge. As the sun began to set over the estate, casting long golden shadows across the library floor, Clara picked up her pen. She didn't write about shadows anymore. She wrote about the light. And as she looked at her husband, she knew that the greatest story was the one they were living. A story of fulfillment, of joy, and of a peace that would last a lifetime.